Welcome. My name is Jerry Yelton. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Programs and Development Director for Charlotte Pride. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself as we get started?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Comer, pronouns he, him, and I am Charlotte Pride's Communications Director. Happy to be here.
Fabulous. We are really excited to talk with y'all. Doing these presentations and having these kind of community conversations is really one of my favorite parts of doing this work because so much of how we can make our community better is through education, talking about our history, talking about our community, all of the different identities and groups and folks that are encaptured in the LGBTQ family. So I'm really excited to tell you a little bit more about that, tell you a little bit more about us. As was mentioned at the beginning, this is a space for questions. So as we're going through, if something doesn't make sense, if you want us to explain it again, try using some different words, because we know some of these terms can be complex, please let us know. We're happy to take pause, go back through something, and then there will also definitely be some time for questions at the end. So first slide here is just mine and Matt's info. So if you'd like to get in contact with either of us, if you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking the whole team, you are more than welcome to shoot either of us an email or a message. And we will be happy to connect with you. We'll share this again at the end. That way, if you're like, well, right now I don't have any questions, but later on you might. So to start us off, want to talk a little bit about what our plan is for today. We're going to talk through what Pride is, where Pride has come from, what Pride has looked like in Charlotte, then go into some LGBTQ terminology and talk through words to say, some terms to avoid that have kind of become outdated, talk about who Charlotte Pride is, what our activities are, what we've done over the past year in the pandemic, and then also have some good action steps and ways for folks to get involved and be a part of the community and help make us better and help make our community stronger overall. So I'm going to pass it off to Matt to kind of talk about what is Pride.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. So I think a lot of people, as has been mentioned already, a lot of people are aware of Charlotte Pride, and probably the first thing that comes to mind when you think of our organization is the most visible thing that we do each year, and that's the Charlotte Pride Festival and Parade that usually happens every August in Uptown Charlotte. It's hard to miss. We kind of take over the entire stretch of Tryon Street, especially on Sunday when we have our parade. But, you know, we have, as an organization, as an LGBTQ community, we constantly ask ourselves, what is Pride? Is it an event that happens on a single weekend every year? Is it a protest? Is it a march? Is it a parade? Because there is a difference between also a march, a protest, and a parade. Is it a party? Is it a community resource fair where people can get connected to potential social services or potential employers? Is it, more broadly, a movement that exists not only locally, but nationally and internationally? And our answer to that is that Pride is a mix of all of these things and a lot bit more. Next slide for me, Jerry. I'm going to take us through and talk just a little bit about the origins of Pride and the Pride movement, because certainly Charlotte Pride or any other local Pride organization in the world would not exist without this basic origin. So first, a caveat to just say that the LGBTQ, or at that time the homosexual, or at that time the homophile movement, did not start with the Stonewall Inn and the Stonewall riots and uprising in June 1969. It had existed for decades, centuries in some cases, in small ways. But for the modern LGBTQ movement, historians have generally said that the spark that started significant, sustained LGBTQ advocacy and activism happened as a result of the Stonewall riots and uprising in on June 28th, 1969. And Stonewall Inn was a bar in Greenwich Village in New York City. At the time in New York City and in many places across the country, it was illegal for bars to serve openly homosexual or openly gender non-conforming people. It was just simply illegal. So you had this situation where if you had a gay or a queer bar, in many places it was run by organized crime, the mafia, the mob, whatever you'd like to call it. That was certainly the case with the Stonewall Inn. And like any other old school mafia story, how this illegal business operated was that the mob would pay them off every once in a while. Police would do a raid every once in a while to keep up appearances that they were enforcing the law. But eventually, the patrons of the Stonewall Inn, which ran the gamut from closeted New York City gay men who were bankers all the way down to homeless street kids and street hustlers, transgender folks, drag queens, gender nonconforming, ran the full gamut. They got tired of it. And much as we have seen throughout the entire history of the U.S. with various minority communities actively fighting against police brutality, we think of all the things that have happened over the past year, 5, 10 plus years with the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not a new concept. People shouldn't act like protests against police brutality is a new thing, because that's what the Stonewall riots were. Multi-day, almost a week-long, violent uprising against police brutality. And next slide for me, Jerry. So this began a movement. 1 year later, on June 28th, 1970, you had several large cities, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. At this time, this was not known as Gay Pride. It was not a Pride Day. It was the Christopher Street Liberation Day, and you had Christopher Street Liberation Day marches and protests in large cities across the country. The Stonewall Inn is located, it's still present today. It's a historic landmark in Greenwich Village. You can go there, you can grab a drink. It's located on Christopher Street, hence the name Christopher Street Liberation Day. From this, you immediately see through the rest of the year of the 1970 into 71, 72, the formation of what will become some of the strongest, earliest LGBTQ civil rights organizations in the country. That's the Gay Liberation Front. They are the ones who organized the 1970 march. You had the Gay Activists Alliance, who took a little bit of a different take on their activism, a little less liberationist, a little bit more assimilationist for them. And then you also had the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR. Caveat, transvestite is not a word we use anymore. It's actually quite offensive, but in this historic context, that's what it was called. Founded by two folks who were at the Stonewall Inn on June 28th in '69, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, to work directly with transgender folks. Next slide for me, Jerry. So it took a while for the LGBTQ movement to get a foothold in Charlotte. And it took a while for annual Pride activities to begin, annual commemorations of the Stonewall riots. There was some early organizing in Charlotte. The state's first LGBTQ newspaper, the Charlotte Free Press, was started here in the mid-1970s. We did have, for like 18 months, a chapter of the Gay Liberation Front. Didn't last very long. It was started by a couple students from UNC Charlotte. But in 1981 is when we get our first, I guess you'd say, bona fide Pride event in Charlotte. The history is a little muddy. It was either at Bryant Park. You could see pictures of it here. It was either at Bryant Park or this was somewhere on the campus of UNC Charlotte. It's unclear. You'll notice in those photos, there's not a lot of people there. They didn't do a lot of advertising for this. It was all word of mouth. There were no corporate sponsors, save one. You can see the Budweiser truck there. And 40 years later, Budweiser is still present. So there, but that was the first event. In the 80s, you get some picnics, you get some things here and there that people do. But Charlotte, for the most part, doesn't have any large-scale annual Pride events like you see in Atlanta or DC or New York, Los Angeles for a long time. And that's because North Carolina's queer community was just not very big. Instead of each individual city having a large-scale celebration, the state had a large-scale celebration that began in Durham in 1981, and many times would travel around to different cities. Charlotte hosted that North Carolina Pride March in 1994. It existed, of course, of the march. They also had a conference. They also had a vendor fair and festival, and lots of other activities there. Not until 2000 does our organization get founded. So we are founded in 2000, still very small at the time. For folks who are watching or participating today, if you've been in Charlotte for a long time, you realize that even up into the late 1990s, Charlotte was a very small, conservative, southern banking town. And so the community may have been large, but just wasn't very open. So first festival in 2001 was small. We finally moved to the heart of Uptown on South Tryon Street in 2011. And in 2013, we introduced a parade. And we've got a parade. Next slide for me, Jerry. So speaking about how small it was, I've been involved in the organization as a volunteer board member or staff since 2008. And when I came on board in 2008, the event was not on public property. It was on private property. It was not very visible. It was on private property because in past years, anti-gay protesters had come out in the same strength and the same number as festival attendees. So going to festival or going to private property allowed organizers to control the influx of anti-LGBTQ protesters. But I got involved in 2008. We had maybe 7,000 people attend a 6-hour festival. In 2010, it was still a 6-hour festival. We maybe had 10 grand. And over the past decade, which I think is a testament to the growth of Charlotte, even in the 2010s, our event has grown from that 10,000 all the way up to 2019, our last in-person event. We had over 200,000 visitors over the course of the weekend. And somehow, some way, a parade that was begun only in 2013 has become the city's largest parade by number of marchers and entries, marching contingents in the parade. So we're very grateful of that for this growth. Again, a testament to Charlotte's growth. Next slide for me, Jerry. Oh, well, that's the history. And I would love if at the end, if there are questions about the history, we could take that. But I'm going to pass it over to Jerry to talk a little bit more about general community topics.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. It's always cool hearing about the history of our community here in Charlotte and kind of watching that in parallel to the stories that we've heard about the national movement. So excited to kind of shift from that and shift from the large event focus to talk a little bit more about LGBTQ terminology. Talk first about some words that we shouldn't say that are older terms or terms that you may have heard in the past. So these are kind of words that you want to hear today and then just kind of eliminate from your vocabulary tomorrow. So first thing is lifestyle. You frequently hear this as the gay lifestyle, the homosexual lifestyle, and that's just not really a way to refer to a person. Someone lives as their authentic self, not in a lifestyle or a way that is all that different from you. So referring to someone's LGBTQ identity as a lifestyle trivializes them and removes their ability to be a person first. Another couple of terms are homosexual and transsexual. These are terms that some individuals may still use, but are very much regarded by the majority of the community as very outdated, very technical, almost medical terms. So we've kind of shifted away from these. You'll hear folks who did previously identify with homosexual most often use the word gay. And you'll hear those who may have used the word transsexual in the past use words like transgender or simply trans as a shortened word. Another term here is transgendered with an ED. And the reason I say with the ED is because that's what's incorrect about this. When you say someone is transgendered, instead of saying a person is a transgender person, you are saying it as if something has happened to them, as if something was done to them to make them transgender. And Not the case. They simply are a trans person because that is who they are. So that is a important distinction, and one that, like, most people are fairly understandable if you make a slip up there, but just another way to make your language more affirming to those around you. Another language that we have moved away from is sex change in reference to someone's transition. And I'll talk a little bit more in a couple of slides about what the word transition means in a more modern context. But the idea of a sex change or a sex change surgery is not how we refer to transitioning any longer. Sexual preference is another word, kind of like homosexual, and goes along with preferred pronouns. It's not someone's preference. It's not what they would like or what they might like. It is who they are. It is their sexual orientation, their sexual identity, or the pronouns that they use to refer to themselves. So these are kind of some words to shy away from, and that would be not that helpful unless I went on and gave you some terms that are the right words to use. Any questions on this terminology here before we shift to the positive lens of what language to use?
Oh, I'll just say this is very helpful.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. And as was said at the beginning, this will be available online too. And if you have any further questions later, or you're trying to explain it to a friend and you don't remember how it went, feel free to send their info our way. We're happy to talk with them too. Awesome. All right. So how we have this divided for these next couple of slides is LGBTQ terms that have to do with sexual and romantic orientation. And then the next slide is on gender identity. So the reason you don't see words like trans, pronouns, things like that on the slide, because that's where we're going to go in a second. So first off, let's define sexual and romantic orientation. Sexual orientation is sexual attraction, who you would like to take to bed with you and who you are sexually attracted to. The reason we separate that from romantic attraction is because romantic attraction is simply who you want to have a romantic relationship with. For the majority of people, these two overlap. If you are a gay man, you likely are sexually and romantically attracted to other men. But for some folks, especially folks within our asexual community, they feel romantic attraction, but just may not have any sexual attraction or a combination of that. LGBTQ is kind of our general blanket word for our larger community. This is one of the simplest but most encompassing acronyms: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. The reason we use queer there is that queer is a good overall term for anyone whose identity is not captured in those first four letters. I will give the major caveat with the word queer that many young folks, like myself and Matt, are very comfortable with that word. There are many older members of our community who had that word used consistently against them as a slur and do not feel comfortable using that word. So when referring to it, especially for those of you who are allies in this space and trying to learn how to most appropriately refer to our community, LGBTQ is a perfect way. I promise you're not going to offend any LGBTQ person by saying that acronym as your good go-to. To continue defining some of these words here, lesbian is a woman who is attracted to other women. I think most of us are familiar with that term. Gay is someone who is attracted to someone of the same sex. Most frequently, we hear this in connection with gay men, but there are women who use the term gay to describe their sexuality as well. Bisexual is a word that most people are familiar with and think it means someone who is attracted to men and women. In fact, it simply means someone who is attracted to two genders. And if you're hearing two genders, you're probably going, does that mean there's more than two? And there are. We'll talk about non-binary genders on the next slide. But bisexual in a more modern context is a good way to think about someone who is attracted to two genders. I'm seeing a comment here. Some people really do hate the word queer, but it's good for a lot of other folks too. So I appreciate, Howie, that you're able to kind of understand the good and bad parts of that language. Same with you, Gray. And I think it's a good word that helps us work to be affirming to those around us, but also always having that conversation of why it can be a word that some folks don't love. We have a board member on the Charlotte Pride team that when I joined staff in 2017, I used the word queer, and she almost threw a book at me because she was so unfamiliar with the word being used in a positive context. And now a couple years later, we joke about that, and she uses the word queer frequently because she understands the shift in definition. So it's all about having continuing conversation because these terms do continue to just grow and change and shift.
Yeah, and Jerry, I'm just hop in real quick and
Please.
add that a lot, there is a lot of interesting things to say about the word queer. One thing when we talk about it, because it always comes down to this dichotomy, it seems, between the use of the word queer as a reclaimed self-identifier, community identifier is 40 years old.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. Matt is a unofficial official historian of all things queer Charlotte. So if you want to learn more about the history of our language here in Charlotte, and even on a much larger scale, Matt is your go-to person for that, for sure. Another important term is pansexual. This is a word that we've really seen an advent of use in the past 5-10 years. This is a word similar to bisexual, but instead of only meaning two genders, it means that someone is open to romantic or sexual relationships with someone of any gender. So it's kind of a larger term that just means a way that people frequently talk about this is seeing the person first. And you don't have a kind of a comprehension of what their gender is. All that matters to you is that you like and have the connection to the person. And then the final term on the sexual and romantic orientation slide is asexual. This is a term that simply means someone does not have a sexual attraction, or if it was the word aromantic does not have a romantic attraction to others. This does not mean that someone cannot form long-term bonds, cannot be in a relationship with someone. It just may not be in the same context that most people think of long-term bonds or relationships. Yes, Gray, happy to include it. It's a term that is not often enough talked about. And I think it was it Asexuality Awareness Day on Wednesday of this week, Matt? Does that sound right? Yeah, so an important word that we always want to make sure is brought up because there's so many so many terms in our language and in our LGBTQ lexicon that many people just haven't heard before. And it's okay if after hearing this slide, you're going, oh my gosh, this is so many words and there's another slide after this. That's okay. What matters is that you're here and listening and trying to learn these terms better. And if you forget and if you fumble, that's okay. Apologize, learn from the moment, and continue learning after that. Looking at a comment here. Yeah, definitely hear that some generations are feeling the word is incredibly derogatory. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, and even coming out in the late 2010s, yes, I frequently had the word used against me derogatorially. And I think it's, like Matt just put, it's so important to consider personal experiences. What does I stand for in LGBTQIA? That is a perfect transition over to our gender identity slide. So that is one of our words right over here. So I'll start with I since we have that direct question. I is intersex. This is someone who has physical or like chromosomal characteristics of both the male and female sex. Thus, they are intersex and have a combination of those characteristics. What that means in practicality takes a million different forms for a million different people. Many people are intersex and simply don't know it because they've never had their chromosomes looked at deeply, unless there was a reason to. So that is the term I in the LGBTQIA acronym. So what we're going to talk about here is gender identity. And the reason we say gender identity versus gender is that we are talking about how a person personally sees themselves, their identity that they hold integral to their own sense of self. First word here is kind of the most important blanket term for this component of our community, trans/transgender. They're kind of used interchangeably. Many trans folk abbreviate the word and say trans instead of saying the full term. What this simply means is someone whose birth sex that they were labeled with when they were born by a doctor or medical professional does not align with how they currently view their gender. So I'm an example of this. I identify as non-binary. When I was born, I was assigned male at birth, and I do not identify with that word anymore, identify as non-binary. Thus, I am a trans person. The opposite word of that is cisgender. This is someone whose birth sex was assigned at birth, and they continue to identify with that same sex. So many times we think of straight as the inverse of all things LGBTQ, but it is actually the inverse of gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, and trans and cis are the inverse terms for one another. Gender fluid and non-binary are two words with similar meanings. These are identities that mean that someone does not identify as male or female. They either identify somewhere along the spectrum as a combination of those two genders. They may identify completely outside of it. Their presentation may be masculine, may be feminine, may be a combination of the two. But simply put, these words and a few others like genderqueer just mean that the person is not male or is not female. Gender nonconforming is another kind of blanket word used here to refer to folks who do not conform with the kind of assigned gender standards. And this word frequently is in reference to folks whose physical or mannerisms and characteristics are different from what you would expect for their gender as kind of society has set up. But this word can also mean cisgender folks who simply aren't expressing themselves in ways that a cisgender person might. A good example of this is my partner loves makeup, but he identifies as a cisgender man. So that is a gender nonconforming characteristic of his. Next component here, and one of the most important when thinking about our trans community, are pronouns. You can see on my name, on Matt's name, and a few of the other folks in here, in a parenthetical beside our names, we have our pronouns. And the reason we do that is, and the reason we introduce ourselves with those, is that helps folks know how to refer to you. Frequently we do this by accident, but we'll refer to someone as they or theirs when referring to their cup that's on the table because we don't know their gender. And introducing yourself with your pronouns breaks down that need for someone to assume what your gender is and allows trans folks that have not expressed their pronouns publicly in that space to feel comfortable. The most common three examples of pronouns are listed here: he, him, she, her, and they, them. There are many more that I'm not going to go into because they are a little more difficult for some folks to understand on first reference, but if someone tells you they use pronouns other than any of these three, work to respect it. And it's okay if you slip up and accidentally use the wrong pronoun on someone. If you think about it yourself and realize, oh, I did that, say, I'm sorry, I'll do better next time, and then just move right on. The biggest thing there is to not make it a big deal and then make the person feel like they have to accept your big grand apology of accidentally doing something. They know you didn't mean to do it. They know you're trying because you already said, oh, I'm sorry, I'll do better. But if you go, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, please forgive me, I didn't mean to do that, I'll never do it again. Oh my, suddenly you've made the burden exist on that person's shoulders for the thing that you did wrong. So just being careful of that. And I see a comment, if you're cisgender and don't think people need your pronouns, they do. It normalizes it for trans people. Yes, exactly. So when a cisgender person in a space introduces with pronouns, that breaks down the barrier for a trans person to feel comfortable expressing their pronouns. I only use they, them pronouns, and frequently, because of how I look, folks call me he. And in spaces where I haven't heard other people talk about pronouns, I don't correct them because I worry that they're going to be combative with me or not understand what's going on. But if at the beginning of that session, the presenter or someone else in the room had said, hey, I use these pronouns and my name is da da da, I would know that I would be more comfortable in that space to say, actually, I use they, them pronouns and not have it become a big deal. So that is a really phenomenal act of allyship as a cisgender person to use your pronouns in presentations, in meeting new people. Another couple of words here are surgery. We talk about frequently, the previous language was sex change surgery. Most frequently currently, it is gender reassignment surgery. And the big thing here is unless you're going through the surgery yourself, or someone that you know is talking to you about their surgery, it doesn't matter to you. It is not important what someone's body looks like to you unless they are your sexual partner. So don't worry about asking about what surgeries a trans person has or has not had. Don't worry about, quite simply, don't worry about it. It's okay unless someone is talking to you about it. Another important term here is transition. What this means is the period of time when someone is expressing that the gender that you have known them as is not the gender that currently aligns with how they view themselves and that they'd like to be referred to differently. A transition for someone can be a very quick thing where they just say, hey, I'm still going to use the same name, but could you call me by a different pronoun now? I'd like to be referred to as this. And that's kind of all their public transition is. It may be the time where someone begins to dress completely differently, identify with a new name, work to do legal name changes. There's really such a scope of what a transition can look like for a trans person. So again, as allies in the space, all you need to do is be affirming. Make sure that your trans family, friends, coworkers know that you're open to being there for them. And if they confide in you, hey, I'd like you to start using this name or these pronouns for me, say, sounds great, buddy. If I ever mess up, just correct me. And that's all we need to hear, is just that someone is there and ready to listen and ready to continue learning with us. So, pro tips for LGBTQ terminology, just some things to kind of keep in mind, and then I'll open up for questions. You can see here some of the beautiful faces of our 2021 volunteer team, still meeting virtually, but fingers crossed we'll be meeting in person very soon. But some good tips here can center around coming out as one of the important things. Frequently, when someone comes out to you, you go, oh my goodness, I didn't know, or wow, that's crazy, I never would have guessed. Please don't do that. All you need to do when someone comes out to you is say, thank you for sharing that with me. Do you want me to tell other people or correct other people if they make the wrong assumption? And if they say yes, great, do that for them. If they say no, keep it between you and them. And a really important thing is never forcing someone to come out. We all have seen folks in our lives that we're like, oh, I bet that person is LGBTQ. It doesn't matter to you unless they feel like opening up to you about it. So try not to be like, hey, I heard you might be, or here's this. Really give folks the space. Be welcoming, using your pronouns when you introduce yourself, having up little rainbow flags in your office or in your space. Those kind of small gestures can be such a good way for someone to know that you are a resource to them, not an overbearing, well-intended but overbearing ally. And an important thing with the word ally is it's not a noun. You aren't just an ally by self-identifying as one. You are an ally to any community, whether that is an LGBTQ identity, whether that is a racial minority, whether that is to any community that you are not a part of, unless you are actively working to help their lives be better. And that's things as simple as correcting things that are said incorrectly about them. It's as big as helping volunteer with activities and being a part of those organizations. And a huge part of being an ally is just listening. talking to your friends, talking to those in your community who are a part of a group that you are not, and making sure that they have what they need. Another of my favorite pro tips is Google. Frequently as LGBTQ people, we are the only LGBTQ person in a space, and every other person, because they want to learn more, goes, ooh, I should ask them every question I've ever had about what it's like to be LGBT. And some people love that. Some people are super willing to do that. Usually those folks will tell you that they're super willing to do that. Some people, they may have told you that they have a partner of the same gender, or may tell you that they use different pronouns than you thought they did, but they don't want to act as your perpetual resource bank for all things queer. So use Google when you have a question that you're not sure about, and see what you can find online. And it's okay to have conversations, but preface it with a, hey, I have a question, I've done some Googling, could we talk about this? And be open to them saying no, and you going, that's okay, we can talk about it another time, or don't have to. But when you Google, my biggest pro tip, don't just Google one thing. Look at least 3, 4, 5 different sources. I know I'm talking with librarians and people that use librarians, so I don't think I need to clarify that you only have to go to one source in this space, but make sure you're looking at a few different articles. It's really important, because you may find one article that defines a term in one way, and 3 more that say that article is so wrong. And the biggest thing for a pro tip here is to continue learning. None of us know every single thing about the LGBTQ community, including those of us in it. There's always new terminology that is being refreshed, reclaimed, new words that are changing in definition, and it's important to just continue your education and continue learning how we can serve our whole LGBT community, our Black and Brown members of our community, our trans community members. It's so essential that we are perpetually considering how we can be better to one another and advocate for one another more fully. So now what we are going to do is shift into talking a little bit about Charlotte Pride. And I do want to make sure we have some time for questions, so I'm going to hop through these components pretty quickly. We've definitely had an interesting last year. We're used to our big in-person 200,000 person festival and having in-person activities for all the things you see on screen, but we worked to do virtual community conversations a lot like this, hosted virtual film screenings, and we're really excited to take those lessons learned as we start to make our 2021 plans throughout this year. So, as you know, we are most known for the festival and parade that happens in August, but we have quite a few other great things going on. Firstly is Reel Out Charlotte. That is the LGBTQ film festival here in Charlotte. So if you love movies, love seeing stories about folks that are different from you, come join us. We're really excited in the coming months to have some in-person, socially distanced outdoor film screenings. So follow us on social media and you can hear more about that. On the topic of social media, Charlotte Pride TV is our bi-weekly web show. Every other Wednesday, we air an episode of this where we spotlight a different component of our community. The one that's coming up in about a week is going to talk about the newly introduced LGBTQ legislation here in the state of North Carolina. Some bills that are really great and helping us be in a better case. Sorry, my dog's vet is giving me a call right now. And others that are not great bills that we need to do our part in advocating against. We have outreach programs specifically for the trans, Latinx, and women's communities so that those 3 groups have the opportunity to connect with members that are like them, and those of us who aren't parts of those groups to learn from them and seek education and resources there. We have a scholarship excuse me, for LGBTQ young folks seeking higher education. So if you know a young person who is LGBTQ or a strong ally, make sure you have them check out our scholarship on our website. It is open through July of this year. We have our interfaith programming where we work to bring together communities of faith of all different denomination and background to hold conversation and remind folks that you still have a place in faith space, even if you are LGBTQ and have felt discrimination from those spaces before. And really all throughout the year, we work with community partners, other organizations to put together activities and events that answer needs as they come up. We actually are starting a book club in the next couple of weeks, beginning with reading an Angela Davis book. So if you'd like to join that, information is also available on our Facebook. And yeah, follow us online. There's always new things going on, and we'd love to have you be a part of it. Want to always take a moment to acknowledge some of the other awesome organizations in Charlotte and North Carolina that do great work for our queer community. One of my personal favorites is our friends at Charlotte Black Pride, who do particular outreach and activities for Black LGBTQ folks. There's Time Out Youth, and they work specifically with young LGBTQ people. There's also, not on this slide, but want to make sure we shout them out, Gender Education Network, which works with kids that are too young to go to Time Out Youth, so that under 10-year-old bracket for trans and gender nonconforming kids. Transcend Charlotte works with transgender adults. The LGBTQ Elders works with the oldest members of our communities. RAIN, NCAN, and Powerhouse Project all work to provide resources for those living with HIV and AIDS, as well as testing services. Equality North Carolina is probably the organization you're most familiar with. This is the statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. The LGBTQ Chamber of Charlotte works with queer businesses and queer business owners and LGBTQ affirming spaces. And then the last three here, the Pride Band, One Voice Chorus, and the Gay Men's Chorus of Charlotte, are arts groups that do wonderful performances and give opportunity for queer people to express their incredible artistic talents. There are many, many others that aren't on this list that I'd love to sing the praises of. So if you have other interest in things that might have LGBTQ ties, please feel free to reach out. Happy to connect you with some other groups that are also present. But last couple of action steps before we open for some questions in the last 15 minutes or so. Number one, get involved and volunteer. That can be with us. Our volunteer application is still live on our website. We have a ton of opportunities to be a part of the festival and parade programs over the course of this summer, but also all of the other groups that we've mentioned have a ton of great opportunities too. So utilize your own resources and time and skills and give back to these groups. And if you can't, donating financially is also a great way to support the different organizations. Put your pronouns in your email signature. Nice and simple, having Jerry Yelton, they, them, theirs pronouns, Programs and Development Director, Charlotte Pride. Looks super simple, and most people won't notice it because not too many people look at your email signature unless they need your phone number. But trans folks that are looking, queer folks that are looking for safe spaces and safe individuals will see that and immediately trust you so much more deeply and feel like they have a place within your organization. Attend events and be visible. Right now, this is a little different because we're still attending events virtually, but once we can be in person, come to different activities. Come join us at a Real Out film showing. Come see us at the Festival and Parade. Come join us for a Latinx, Trans, or Women's Pride activity. We'd love to see you, and you might run into someone that you know and they go, oh wow, I didn't know they'd come to an event like this. That's awesome. I know that they're a safer person for me. A big thing, talk to your friends. Use your education that you've gained here today and that you continue to use to correct things that folks say that aren't quite right. Stand up against outright bigotry or ignorance that folks express, and just tell people about what you learned. You don't have to wait for a moment where you're correcting something they've done wrong. You can be like, hey, today I was in a session and I didn't know the words non-binary or asexual, and now I do. I'd love to tell you what those mean. That is such an important thing for allies to do because it removes that need for queer people to do that education in every moment of our lives. And then lastly, most importantly, please goodness vote. Please vote in every election, not just the big ones. We are a nonpartisan organization, so I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. Some of the other orgs I mentioned on the previous slide have some voter education guides, but please make sure you're voting in primaries, in municipal elections, in general elections. It is so important to always be seeking pro-LGBTQ candidates that can be there for us and actually make legislative change to make our lives safer. So that is everything from us today. I know that's a whole lot of new information, a whole lot of new things, but I've enjoyed talking with y'all, and I'm glad that we still have about 15 minutes. So I would love to open up For any questions that anyone on the line has, feel free to drop them in the comments or unmute yourself and ask them out loud.
Jerry and Matt, thank you so much. And I do want to remind people that this will get uploaded to YouTube. It's a very content-rich presentation, so if people want to review it, we'll have it on our library's YouTube channel.
Great.
Quick comment. I'm glad that you reemphasized the point about using the pronouns. I like to use my address. Well, I like to go ahead and actually have some other comments where I have like my email and phone number, etc. But it's good to know that there really is an additional point of importance shared with that as far as having the pronouns.
Great. Glad that was helpful. And I love how AW in the comments put it. It is a requirement to love and respect one another. Awesome. Absolutely. What other questions do we have? And if you don't have any, or if you don't want to ask your question because you don't want to be on a recording asking what you think might be a silly question, please utilize our emails that are on screen. We're happy to answer them offline.
Well, Jerry and Matt, I would just like to say thank y'all for the information. I think that being aware and being respectful of people is incredibly important. You know, for me, I don't want my ignorance to offend or harm somebody.
Yeah.
And my personal experience was that, you know, I had a phenomenal uncle and aunt who were, you know, gay and lesbian. And in the 70s, you know, it was kind of, you know, I looked at my family as this family that would go to church and, you know, beat you down with the Bible and so forth. But yet they literally ostracized the two family members that showed me the most love.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand that until I got older, and it made sense to me. Okay, this is why they didn't come to church with us. And I thought that was so disrespectful and offensive. Because, you know, at the end of the day, they weren't just abusing them, they were abusing me. And now it made sense that, what's the old saying, hurt people hurt people?
Yep.
And so for me, it's always been about, you know, not judging anybody, but taking everybody for how they are, how they wish to be. You know, I always tell people, you know, I'm not about treat people the way you want to be treated. I'm about treat people the way they wish to be treated.
Yes.
You know, because, and then I think for me being in a, you know, I'm in the trauma-informed care business. I think that it really does start with respect and, to your point, listening and finding out why, you know, not necessarily why people are the way they are, but appreciate them for what they are, for what they wish to be. And so we, you know, as an organization, and, you know, and being that, you know, I'm the head of that organization. I love you, and I love Matt, and I love the fact that there are people like, you know, you who are opening themselves up with their story, and that's not always an easy story to tell. But I think the strong people, like people ask me all the time, you know, how can you be in this environment? And I always share with folks is, until you get on the other side of fear, you're going to be stuck. You know, you're going to be stuck. And for me, I just wish for everybody to get these toxins up out of their bodies so that they don't die from within, so they aren't depressed, and they're not thinking about suicide or homicide. And so I love the fact that you and Matt are bringing this platform forward so that more people can really understand, you know, what it is and what people go through, and that, you know, something that's, it may seem as simple as, you know, your pronoun. I didn't understand that 2-3 years ago. I get it now, but that's something that needs to be shared as an educational standpoint so that we don't have our children, shut down in silence. I always tell people silence leads to violence. These secrets that we have to harbor or people are harboring, it shuts people down and out. And so thank God, folks like y'all who's speaking for the voiceless. And if I and our organization can support y'all, we will definitely be there and be there as a champion, because no one is going to harm another person in my world. And that's what we're about. So,
Cheers to that. Thank you for sharing. We really appreciate it. And I think you put perfectly there what it's like to talk about to other people in your life, how to be a safe space, and how to talk about that you are an open resource to folks. So that, folks, and he's not a plant, I promise, but he did a perfect job of showing how to talk to others and how to share pieces of your story and open yourself up to have them share their story with you too. So thank you for that.
appreciate it.
Any other questions, folks?
Sure. I have another question.
Yeah.
Question in addition to aside from a comment. I work with Greg and others with the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library and with the nonprofit team. I believe I saw that likely you and others with Charlotte Pride have backgrounds in nonprofits, working with nonprofits. And how has it really helped you as far as what you're doing with Charlotte Pride?
It's a good question, Matt. You wanna talk to that?
I don't know. I'm going to answer the question the way I'm not quite sure how to answer the question. I will say this: I have worked in the LGBTQ community in some form or fashion since I was a teenager, and which sounds weird. I count that as part of my like quote unquote professional experience. It sounds weird. Why would a 15-year-old have professional experience? But in 2000, wasn't a lot of LGBTQ stuff going on. And so even a 15, 16-year-old in 2000 was and could end up accidentally becoming a spokesperson. Anyway, so for over 20 years now, I've have worked in the community. I think all that experience helps me to realize that whether you're working with like bona fide nonprofit organizations, large or small, or whether you're working with small groups of community members, like in a neighborhood or whatever, or some coalition, that really the most important thing that anybody can do in the nonprofit or community organizing space is just build relationships. Like, I know that sounds really simplistic, but that's the biggest lesson that I've learned, is just like meeting people where they're at and really understanding that every person knows something a little bit different than every other person, and every person has the room for growth and change. And so I also come from a faith background, and so building relationships is very much a part of that, providing room for growth. I think if you start from that core, then all the other pieces of nonprofit work, whether it's fundraising, whether it's again, coalition building, whether it's doing strategic planning or board development, all of it will flow quite nicely if you start from the basis of having a human-centered, relationship-oriented outlook on your work.
Thanks. Oh, and one other thing too, as far as when there is the Charlotte Pride Parade, which of course was mentioned repeatedly, and actually it's good it is, how helpful is it to have an ally like the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library participate?
So essential.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing as you, Jerry. Absolutely essential. Because I think the library is not just an ally. The library belongs to all people in the community. And so there are people, you have patrons of the library that are LGBTQ, you have employees of the library who are LGBTQ. And so very much the library can and should be a wonderful community partner to us, but to the entire county.
Absolutely. It's in the same way that it's important to talk to those around you about what things are going on in the world and ways that you want to help support them. Having folks like the library present at Charlotte Pride show off that the library is somewhere that is affirming and welcoming. So it's all about that, showing up for one another. That's kind of how everything goes down to the core of it, is showing up and being there for each other.
And I would add that the experience may be different for young people today because the internet is so ubiquitous. But for low-income young people who don't have ready access to the internet, the library may still play an incredibly important role in young people's development of who they are in much the same way it did for me. It was not possible for me to Google topics around LGBTQ issues. I did it at the Forsyth County Library. So the library, I think, is essential, especially to the development of young people.
I see a question in the comments. What is the right way to correct patrons or strangers if we witness them using the incorrect pronouns? So the big thing is to not make it a big deal, first and foremost. You don't want to be like, whoa, stop, you misgendered someone, how dare, because then you like make it a big deal for the trans person you're trying to protect, and it's become a big kerfluffle. No one wants that. So it's really kind of context dependent. If it is someone that you know, in that moment, it's a great time to be like, hey, they use these pronouns. And if it is someone to where you don't feel comfortable correcting them in front of others, frequently it can be difficult to do that with like a supervisor or people that are above you in a hierarchy. Having conversations with them offline later. It's important to acknowledge that we're always trying to do our best. Sometimes we can't do the very best in a singular moment, but trying to follow up and find moments to have those. So the easy way to do it is just be like, hey, they use these pronouns, and just kind of say and move right on past it. That way it doesn't become a big deal and cause more drama or more issue for the folks. Okay, I know we're hitting right at 1 o'clock, or 1 o'clock, goodness. I don't know what time I think it is, apparently. For those of you watching on recap, maybe it is 1 o'clock. Maybe I'm talking to those watching at a later time. But any final questions before we wrap up today?